Right, now to the interesting bit, our guest speaker. We're delighted to have with us Dr. Helen Senn, Head of Conservation and Science Programme of the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland. Dr. Senn gained her PhD in evolutionary biology in 2009. She had spent some of her summers as an undergraduate at St Andrews University, where she gained a BSc Honours, volunteering on a research project on the island of Rum. This inspired her to apply for a PhD to work with the same group. This she achieved at Edinburgh University. Now, this bit I do like. After completing her PhD, she spent a year cycling from Scotland to China. I'm sure that alone would make a very interesting presentation. Arriving back in Scotland, she took a technical post in a newly formed lab at Edinburgh Zoo. 8 years later, in her role of Head of Conservation and Science Programmes, she manages a team of 10 researchers and field biologists. She manages, this includes the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, Welljane's Lab, which is one of only a handful of applied conservation genetic laboratories in the world. Helen, we look forward to hearing your talk. And for those of you who don't know, if you go onto your screen, you'll be able to get the actual speaker view. So, Helen, welcome.
Hello. Thank you so much, everybody. It's really wonderful to be here and see so many faces from all across the world. And also thank you so much to those of you who've turned up twice to my talk, and for Bill for having a talk up his sleeve, and for Ian for inviting me back again to talk to you. So it's really great to be here. And my colleague Jess is here as well in case of another technological failure, and I have every faith that you can pick up where I leave off. So I've got a few PowerPoint slides to share with you, which I'll do now, but also really happy to have a discussion at the end if anybody has any questions. I've already been sent a few by Ian, which I've tried to answer within the space of the talk, but we could talk a bit more afterwards. So shall I take it away with the presentation? Yeah, great. Right, so hang on, just going to share my screen.
That's good.
Can everybody see that? Yes.
Yep.
Good. Great. Okay. Great. Well, so my name's Helen, and I'm Head of Conservation and Science at the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, as Bill so kindly introduced me. And I'm just going to talk to you a little bit today about what we do as an organisation, but also really starting with, I suppose, the role that zoos play in conservation globally, because it's possibly not obvious to everybody that the modern zoo has a big role to play within species conservation. So if we think about the zoos within Britain and Ireland, we have 35 million visitors a year, and we contribute in total £31 million to species conservation in the wild, and that's actually 10%, is estimated to be 10% of the total for zoos worldwide. And we also, in total, the zoos that belong to the British and Irish Association of Zoos and Aquariums, the zoos and aquariums that belong to that organisation, support around 800 projects in 105 countries that provide direct conservation action for almost 500 species of animals and plants. And that's really, if you like, our charitable remit is to look after threatened species. And so that's the role that I play within the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland. My role is to help us fulfil that charitable remit for species conservation. And here's a list for British and Crown Dependency Zoos, so that's British Zoos and Durrell Zoo on Jersey, of the 19 species that really would be on the brink of extinction without the intervention of zoos. So this is British and UK's overseas territory species. And we pulled this list together because when the COVID-19 crisis hit, it wasn't obvious to the government agencies that the crisis for zoos went beyond a direct animal welfare crisis. There was a lot of talk, obviously, about it potentially being difficult for zoos to carry on. Animals can't be fellowed, they still need to be looked after. And so many zoos and aquariums during the COVID crisis have experienced extremely high running costs, but also visitor income stopped overnight. And so we've had to collectively, as organisations, we've had to take on considerable amounts of debt during the course of the crisis, and that has obviously an ability to then impact on our charitable outputs, which are often centred around species conservation and education. And a lot of the species that we're really involved in saving from extinction are not necessarily the kinds of animals that visitors want to come and see in zoos. And so this picture here shows the species that are native to Britain and the UK's overseas territories that zoos are playing a really critical role in restoring. And it's, in most cases, it's not an overstatement to say that if there's financial support to the zoos disappeared, these species would be at extreme risk of extinction. A number of these species are already extinct in the wild, and some are on the brink of extinction in the wild. And the two species that RZSS is working on in this category are the wildcat and the pine hoverfly, which are both on here. And of course, we also work on many other, collectively, we work on contributing to the restoration of many other species, both in Britain and globally. But this is kind of a sort of red list of where we're making a really key impact. So in terms of what the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland does, we're a zoological society that was established in 1909. And our mission is really to connect people with nature and safeguard species from extinction, and conservation is an integral part of our charitable charter. We own 2 zoos in Scotland, Edinburgh Zoo and the Highland Wildlife Park, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The Highland Wildlife Park is situated in the Cairngorms National Park near Aviemore in Kingussie. And we manage in total, so my remit is to manage 23 at the moment conservation projects around the world. And these projects are essentially funded primarily through gate take, through our visitor income. And one of the unique things about zoo funding is that it allows for really long-term continuity. A lot of charitable funding is very reliant on a grant cycle of maybe 3 to 5 years. And so projects can be quite short-term, but really conservation and restoration of species requires a long-term sustained effort. And so this is one of the areas where zoos have really been able to make an impact. We are, as Bill mentioned, we're quite unusual in that we have an on-site genetics lab, which is where I started my work, the Wild Genes Laboratory, which really specialises in using kind of a very technical discipline of genetics to assist with species restoration in a variety of different fronts, which I'll touch on in a moment. And we work with returning species to the wild, and we have a variety of different other scientists and particularly veterinary experts who work on projects across the world. And we support 2 particularly large-scale initiatives, and we have done for over 10 years, one in the Brazilian Pantanal and one in Uganda. And this is just a little map of where all of our different projects are situated. And just a picture here for you of my team. Quite a lot, just as you can see here, and quite a lot of people working on site at Edinburgh Zoo, but also Dr Fred Babatwera in Uganda and Dr Arnaud Desbier in Brazil. And really, the work of the conservation department is divided into 2 kind of main areas. One is our field programs, and the other is the RZSS Wild Genes Lab. And our work can be thought of under three themes, really. One is returning species to the wild, which is a really core function of zoos. Ultimately, in my view, and in the view of many people within the zoo world, there's the ultimate point of having animals in captivity is so that they can go back to the wild one day, and that should be at the forefront of modern zoo management. And that's not always the case. It can't be the case for every single animal, and it can't be the case for every single species. Some species are held for educational purposes, but a really core function of zoos is to safeguard threatened animals and safeguard the populations and then return them to the wild. And that's quite a long and involved process. The other is that we use our unique set of skills from handling and managing living collections of animals to assist with a variety of other restoration projects in the wild. And the third is supporting the wild places that those wild animals live in by using species really as an ambassador, as a focus, because many people care, they care very passionately about individual animals or species, especially charismatic species, but ultimately we all know that a tiger can't survive without the forest it depends on, or the prey base that it depends on. And so those animals are often work that zoos conduct, though it's often a driver for much, much wider scale restoration, both of an environment, but also often of working in detail with the human communities in that area as well, to understand things like human-wildlife conflict and how to really integrate species that have been returned to the wild or restored in wild habitats back into a fully functioning ecosystem to which humans also belong. That's the aim. So in terms of translocating species back to the wild, bringing animals back to the wild, we're working on a variety of different projects at the moment. Probably the most well-known of these is the beaver return to Scotland. Beavers went extinct in the 15th century, and because of the fur trade, because of overhunting, and last year they were officially classed again as a protected species within Scotland, and that is a huge success, huge conservation success. There's still a long way to go. Not everybody's hugely pleased about them being back. Many people are delighted, but they do cause conflict within certain areas, and particularly within certain areas of the farming community. But beavers are really important ecosystem engineers. They change river dynamics and improve the riparian ecosystems and species diversity. And ultimately, they were an original part of our ecosystem. And RZSS and the Scottish Wildlife Trust have worked together in partnership for over 10 years to bring beavers back to Scotland, starting initially with a scientific trial that began in Knapdale, and then more recently over the last 3 years, once that trial was deemed to be a success, then reinforcing that population with a variety of other beavers. And another species that we've been working on, which is slightly less glamorous, is the pond mud snail, a very tiny snail that survives in little puddles on farmland. Often these puddles are temporary and they dry up when it's hot. They get flooded when it's wet, and this species is very much on the brink of extinction. It's only found in a handful of sites within the south of Scotland and a couple in England, and we worked on captive rearing pond mud snails at Edinburgh Zoo for a number of years, and then in 2018 we conducted the first ever release of pond mud snails onto Pentland's red moss, and we're hoping to continue monitoring that population and carrying on those releases over the coming years. And perhaps so beavers is perhaps one of our biggest success stories. I think pond mud snails, we still don't know, we've not seen some of the snails that we've not seen evidence of healthy populations being established where we've released snails yet. So that's a critical part of species reintroduction, is to do the monitoring and understand whether things have gone right. Two projects that are at a slightly earlier stage of development are our work on the wildcats and on the pine hoverfly. These are both critically endangered species within Scotland. In fact, some of you may have seen that the British Mammal Society report on the recent status of wildcat, which has been officially declared, according to UK red listing, as critically endangered just the other day. Wildcats are really on the brink of extinction in Scotland. They're our last UK native felid, because we successfully got rid of the lynx many years ago, and obviously some other larger carnivores, including the wolf. And the best estimates for the population now are at less than 100 individuals, and that's because of a real combination of factors. Habitat loss, a huge factor is persecution, but also more recently, wildcats have interbred with domestic cat. They're fairly closely related to domestic cats. About 1 million years of evolution separates the two species. And so they've been kind of diluted, the gene pool's been diluted by what we call hybridization with domestic cat, and also they are susceptible now to diseases that domestic cats carry, such as feline leukemia. And RZSS has for a number of years been managing the conservation breeding program for wildcats, which is actually a network of over 34 different zoological institutions that hold cats across the United Kingdom, and with the eventual plan of returning them to the wild. And we recently received a very large grant from the European Union to establish a conservation breeding for release centre up at Highland Wildlife Park. And the plan is to breed cats in off-show conditions, so away from human contact, and effectively rewild them ready for life in the wild, and then release them. And that's the first release is planned in 2022, and we hope to release 20 cats a year for the following 3 years, so between 2022 and onwards, into the Cairngorms National Park. And this is a hugely challenging project, and one that has certainly experienced some hitches at the moment with the lockdown situation. We are trying to build the breeding enclosures right now, and that's obviously stalled, but we're hoping that we'll be able to have the first cats in the breeding enclosures by Christmas. And another, again, much less glamorous insect, but actually even more threatened than the wildcat, is the pine hoverfly, which is a hoverfly species that depends on old Scots pine, the rot holes in really old, what we call granny pines. And there's not so many of these old pines left. And this fly, the last hasn't been seen in the wild, an adult hasn't been seen in the wild for the last 7 years. And the last count that took place, there were 60 larvae were found. And at that point, we were asked as an organisation to take 24 into captivity and to breed them up at Highland Wildlife Park. And that was 2 years ago. And we took that challenge on with quite some trepidation, because one feels a great burden of responsibility to be left holding the last remaining individuals of a species. And so we took those larvae into captivity, and last year we took them through a first successful breeding cycle. And people often leave captive breeding for a species very, very late. The advice is when a population gets lower than 1,000 individuals, you should start thinking about captive breeding as a possible tool for recovery. But it had been left very late with this species, and that doesn't give a lot of room for manoeuvre, room for error in terms of trying to understand how to get a species to breed. So thankfully we had some advice from some very good experts, and we managed to take the flies through the first breeding cycle, but we only had 13 larvae in the second generation, so that's not very good, really not really very good success. But this year we've had the second cycle of mating, and people can see, if you follow us on Twitter, we've put up lots of exciting videos of pine harbor flies doing their thing. But now we've just counted the offspring of this mating season, and we've got 157. So that's more than probably the population in the wild. So we've got a very long way to go for this species, because we've also got to understand a lot about the conditions in the wild that would make it suitable to release them. And there's lots of habitat improvement initiatives going on with our partners. But it's been a big milestone, and it's been one that we've had to carry on that project during lockdown. So our keepers have spent a lot of time, obviously looking after the polar bear and the wildcats at Highland Wildlife Park, but they've actually had to spend a lot of time watching for these very precious 24 flies that we had, or small numbers of flies that we had to mate and produce their offspring. So it's been quite a challenge. And then we're also involved in providing expertise to a number of other reintroduction projects. One in particular is the scimitar horned oryx reintroduction to Chad, which is the large mammal reintroduction ever conducted. 500 scimitar horned oryx are being returned to the Wadi Akin Wadi Rime Nature Reserve in Chad at the moment. This has been happening over the last few years. Scimitar horned oryx are a mammal which is extinct in the wild. Few people have probably ever heard of it. In fact, I think I've got a picture there. Just flash that up. But there's actually quite a few in captivity. There's over 20,000 in captivity globally. And so the genetics lab has been involved in selecting the appropriate animals for release. It's one component of part of the information that's required to do a reintroduction, is to understand what animals are best to release in terms of their relatedness, to provide genetic diversity and a healthy population later on. So that's something that the Wild Genes Lab has been doing. And we do a lot of our work, a lot of these projects require a really long-term sustained effort, and that means working in partnership. Virtually no conservation projects happen in a vacuum. They require a huge amount of different types of expertise, veterinary expertise, scientific expertise, people who understand about habitat restoration, etc. So we often work in partnership with a variety of organisations to try and get a species to recover from extinction, and obviously that comes with its own challenges as well. And yeah, so here's just that picture of the scimitar horned oryx. So possibly not a species that many have heard of, but it's a large charismatic animal, and it's been rescued from extinction by conservation breeding, and there's still a long way to go. The first births have happened in the wild now. In Chad, the reintroduction is very well funded. It's funded by the Environment Agency of Abu Dhabi. Every single released animal is collared, and a huge amount of information is gathered about those animals. But still, there's no guarantee of success, because there are all sorts of challenges, especially in a country that is as poor as Chad, where there are so many other real challenges with human development. And so working alongside the local populations and the local government to allow them to reap the benefits of species reintroduction is really, really important. But one of the big principles of species reintroduction is that animals should be restored ideally within living memory of going extinct, because once people lose them out of their culture, then they don't really want them back again. And that's of course the situation that we have here. So just touched a little bit on our experts, but we contribute genetic expertise to a lot of different projects, but we also contribute veterinary expertise. We've recently sent our vet Adam to Gough Island. In fact, he got stranded there during the COVID-19 crisis, and this was to help with a project to save the Gough Island moorhen and bunting, whilst a big team was coming to eradicate a non-native mouse species from the island, which was actually destroying a huge number of native bird species, in particular the Tristan albatross. And we hope to send Adam back there next year. And then two projects that touch on some of the questions that were asked. One is our capacity building project in Cambodia. We've been working in Cambodia for about 5 years now, in collaboration with DEFRA and for Flora and Fauna International, on trying to use genetic tools to monitor the illegal wildlife trade. Our scientists have helped scientists at the University of Phnom Penh to establish the first DNA tracing lab for ivory testing. And through that, we've been able to help establish the origin of elephant ivory that's seized within country. And we've actually helped to close a legal loophole that existed in Cambodia, which was that it was illegal to sell Asian ivory, but not illegal to sell African ivory. And through the testing that we've done, we've been able to establish that ivory sold in markets in Cambodia is a mixture of Asian ivory and African ivory. We've been able to establish where in Africa it's coming from. We also made a discovery that some of the ivory was actually mammoth, which is very interesting and something that hadn't been known of before in the country. And also established some of the first presence of rhino horn in the country. And so it's an example of where very technical kind of science, I suppose, can really help practically with law enforcement. Again, there's a long way to go. Testing ivory and establishing its origin isn't saving any elephants yet, but hopefully it helps to with the background scientific knowledge base in order to do that in the future. And then another project, we haven't traditionally worked a lot on marine projects, but there was a question about marine projects. However, it is in our charitable charter that we should be looking after both marine and terrestrial species, and so we've been wanting to grow this area for a number of years. And we're very delighted 2 years ago when our vet Georgina, who's pictured here with Adam, was able to assist the University of St Andrews and Scottish National Heritage with monitoring flapper skates in Loch Sonnet and the Sound of Mull marine protected area. Flapper skates, again, are possibly a species that you've not heard of. They're a large skate, and they can be over 6 foot in width, and they are critically endangered internationally, and that means that Scotland holds some of the last remaining populations of that species in the world. In fact, Loch Sonnet and the Sound of Jura are one of the largest, most they're the sort of population stronghold for this species. And so Georgina is using her veterinary expertise to implant tracking devices into these fish in a very humane way. And then they are gathering information on the movement of these animals using buoys that are kind of submerged within the water column. And it's really great. We're very pleased to be part of that project because we're using our veterinary expertise on a species that we don't have in our collection. Georgina has a lot of experience of marine surgery from working in South Africa at the Two Oceans Aquarium. So sometimes zoo expertise is helping species in the wild that we don't actually hold in captivity. And I've already touched a little bit on the Wild Genes Lab, so I probably won't dwell on that anymore because I've just conscious about time. And then lastly, we've been supporting a number of projects for many years in wild places. In fact, we've just started a new partnership with the Giraffe Conservation Foundation, who are at the forefront of giraffe conservation in Africa, because we are hoping, once things ease with COVID, we're hoping to bring giraffes to Edinburgh Zoo as an ambassador and educational exhibit for our visitors, because they're often voted one of the most popular animals. But we felt it was very important that we really linked having the species back in Edinburgh with conservation in the wild and Giraffe Conservation Foundation work all across Africa on restoring giraffes and reintroducing them to parts of Africa where they've gone extinct. And it's a little known fact that actually giraffes are endangered. The populations are under threat. In fact, there's fewer giraffes than there are elephants in Africa. And the two projects that we've been involved in for a very long time are the Giant Armadillo project in the Pantanal in Brazil, where since 2005 we've been supporting Dr Arnaud Desbier and his team, working on monitoring the giant armadillo and subsequently the giant anteater. And these are little known species, but they are really important parts of the ecosystem. And again, through protecting these species and working with local populations, they're protecting large areas of the habitat that they live in. And we've worked again since about 2005 with the Budongo Conservation Field Station in Uganda. And it's a project that we're very proud of. We have chimpanzees within the Budongo facility at Edinburgh Zoo that some of you may have visited. And this facility is twinned with a field programme in Uganda, in the largest tract of rainforest in East Africa. And the chimpanzees at Edinburgh Zoo are our ambassadors for their cousins in the wild, if you like. And in Uganda, there's in the Budongo forest, there's now 800 chimpanzees in the wild. And the Budongo Conservation Field Station, with our support, has become, over the last 15 years or so, an independent Ugandan NGO that is supported by RZSS, but it's independently run by Ugandan nationals headed by Dr Fred Babatwera. And they are working not only protecting the chimpanzees and studying them, and the studies have contributed to a huge amount of research, fundamental research on primate behaviour, but also on protecting the forest, monitoring its ecology, protecting and monitoring the species within the forest, for example, conducting amphibian surveys, and working very closely with local communities on alternative livelihoods issues. Many of the local communities are very, very poor. They conform to the definition of absolute poverty. They live on less than $1 a day around the edge of the Budongo forest. And Fred and his team, with a number of grants from DEFRA and other funding sources, have worked very closely with local farmers on alternative livelihoods and improving illiteracy within the local populations as well. And it's really a great illustration of how species restoration can't happen in a silo. It requires the involvement of the entire community, and definitely a grassroots effort as well. And so that's perhaps one of our biggest conservation successes, is the ongoing support to that really precious, not only precious primate population, but the tract of rainforest and the people that live around the forest. So I think that's really it from me. I've probably whittled on for far too long, but yes, just a final summary slide of really what we do, and hopefully that's given you just a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of what we're doing at the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland. And if there's any time, then please do feel free to ask me any questions. Thank you very much for listening.